Hey everyone, Tin Man here, and today I'm discussing how to think about and build strong compositions in Dota Underlords. When we talk about compositions, we are mostly talking about mid to late game strategies. A common thing that you hear from newer players is that they have a good early game, but then struggle in the mid game and get crushed in the late game. This is partially due to gold management, as discussed in the last video, but regardless of how much gold you have, if you do not know how to use it to make a good team composition, then it will all be wasted. But what is a composition? A lot of people will classify them very broadly. They may say something like, hunters are very strong right now, or knights need a buff. These labels are drawn from the primary alliance in these compositions, more on that later, but some simple descriptions like this do not tell the whole story. A composition is really like a tree, with a common core but many branching and related paths. Let's take a look at one. Here's an example of a tree that I made for hunters. This covers 8 unit compositions, since in the current meta, most players are able to consistently get to level 8, but not always to level 9. At the top you can see that every hunter's build has a common core of 3 hunters, since that is the lowest tier of the hunter alliance. But after that you can branch into several different paths. As you follow the flowchart, it ends with a letter, and an example of such a build is at the bottom. When you go 6 hunters, here on the left, you'll generally want 2 scaled, picking up Tidehunter and Medusa. But then you have the choice between going for 2 druids, along with 3 elusive, or swapping the druid bonus for the heartless bonus. If you just stick to 3 hunters, over on the 6 elusive side, you will certainly get 2 druids, but then you have the option between getting 2 heartless, 2 scaled, or even the demon bonus. The most complicated branch here is the warrior branch, where you keep 3 hunters and 3 warriors. You will almost always want the heartless in this build, but then you get the choices of several alliances that you can mix and match. As you can see, this can get very complicated very quickly, and just calling it a hunter composition doesn't do it justice. This is only for 8 units. Once you get to 8 to 9 or 10 units, the tree expands and a whole new set of options are available. You notice that there are many alliances that are not brought up in here. While it is technically possible to play something like 3 hunter and 3 mages, or combine hunters with assassins, or even primordials, I did not include them here. Why is that? To answer that, we need a better understanding of the roles that each piece and alliance plays in the composition. Most compositions have 2 parts, a frontline and a backline. Frontline units, as the name implies, are generally placed near the front to take the brunt of opposing attacks. Generally these are melee units, but not always. Backline units are less resilient and are not meant to be attacked right away. They are placed behind the frontliners to ensure that the opposing attacks the frontliners first. Backliners are generally ranged and higher damage dealers, but once again, that's not always true. The relative size of these 2 parts changes based on the composition. The 6 hunter composition will have 6 backliners, so at most 4 frontliners at max level, whereas say a 6 warrior build will have 6 or more frontliners and only 1 or 2 backliners. Alliances are a major part of this framework. The warrior alliance, for instance, allows units to gain extra armor, which makes them better at frontlining. The hunter alliance increases damage output, so it makes for ideal backliners. These are examples of primary alliances, and which are alliances that allow you to build around them to form your front or backline. They are generally more powerful effects than the secondary alliances, and to balance their increased effect, they normally only affect the units within that alliance. In contrast, the secondary alliances are normally weaker effects, but often affect all of your units. These are not powerful enough to build a front or backline based on them alone, but they are complementary to your primary alliances, either covering for a weakness, like say Scaled and Warriors covering both magical and physical damage resistance, or accentuating a strength, like Heartless and Hunter, which both increase physical damage dealt. Let's take another look at that flowchart. Notice how the core at the top, 3 hunters, is a primary backline alliance. The 6 hunter path doubles down on that backline, and then adds a frontline primary alliance, typically elusive. If you take this route, you'll have very little room for secondary alliances since you need both a front and backline, and by doubling down on your primary backline, you limit space for the secondary alliances. Similarly, with the 6 elusive build, you double down on your frontline, making your elusive units very hard to hit. But that limits your damage output, and once you only have a few options left for secondary alliances. But with a 3 warrior and 3 hunter branch, you have a lot of options to mix and match secondary alliances, since you did not double down on a primary one. There are even more options I did not include in this chart, like say warlocks, or other combinations of those 4. So let's go back to the original question from this flowchart. Why do we not see options like mages, assassins, or primordials in here? You can probably guess the answer for mages and assassins by now. They are primary backline alliances which directly conflict with our hunter core. Remember, primary alliances typically only affect the units within those alliances. So if you want 3 hunters and then added 3 assassins, you would just be better off cutting those assassins for 3 more hunters, or vice versa. That way you get a higher tier of the alliance that affects all 6, rather than just 2 lower tiers affecting 3 each. This is the same reason you rarely see knights and warriors played together, or trolls and dragons together. They are both primary alliances and the same role as each other. They do not synergize with each other, they compete for the same role. But what about primordial? Primordial is kind of a primary frontline alliance, but it's often paired along with mages, warriors, and assassins, but not hunters, because of the next big concept, overlap. Since every unit in Dota Underlords has at least 2 alliances, units of your frontline alliance and backline alliance may share a trait or overlap with each other. If you just randomly picked a frontline and backline alliance and put them together, it can kind of work, but it will not be the best unless there is significant overlap between them. Some examples from the Hunter flowchart are Drow Ranger's Heartless Alliance along with Pudge from the Warrior Alliance, or Wind Ranger and Marana along with Treant Protector to get the Elusive Alliance. The reason we don't see any mention of Primordial here is because there's no overlap between them and Hunters. If a future unit comes out and is a Primordial Hunter, that opens up a whole new branch of this tree, but as it stands right now, the only Primordials are Warriors, Mage, Assassin, Shaman, and a Warlock. This overlap is important when building compositions because it allows you to fit the most possible secondary alliances. If you want 3 Hunters and 6 Knight composition, for instance, that will take up the full 9 spots, since there's no overlap between Hunters and Knights. So you add the numbers together. 3 Hunters plus 6 Knights equals 9 units. But if you want a 3 Hunter and a 6 Elusive combination, you would think that would also take 9 units. But since there are 2 Elusive Hunters, you can subtract 2 and achieve this composition in just 7 units. That means you have 2 extra spots to add in secondary alliances, which on the whole will make your composition better compared to the 6 Hunters, 3 Knights, 6 Hunter version. So how do you choose the units? This leads us into a discussion of how to choose those additional units for your comp. The flowchart we discussed only covered 8 unit compositions, but what happens when you want to add a 9th or 10th? The most important thing you should be looking for with every subsequent unit is to complete an additional alliance. Take a look at your alliance tracker on the right side of your screen and look for which alliances you are 1 away from. If you're 1 away from a secondary alliance, your next level up can complete it, and often a 1-star unit that completes that secondary alliance is better than a 2-star unit which doesn't. You may also be 2 units away from a higher tier of a primary alliance, like say you have 4 warriors, and when you level up, you could add another secondary alliance, like say a savage, or, if you have the proper units, you may consider dropping one of your non-warriors to add in 2 warriors when you level up, getting you to the 6 warrior alliance. Ideally, you want to take advantage of all of your units' traits, minimizing the number of uncompleted alliances. When you have uncompleted alliances, ask yourself, what is this unit doing for me, and is there a better option with more overlap? Let's take a look at some examples. In this warrior example, it's a pretty well put together composition. We can see that most alliances are complete to a threshold, with only 2 unfinished alliances, Primordial and Troll. This means that the logical next piece would either be a Primordial, like say Enigma, or a Troll, like Witch Doctor. Both of these units are Warlocks, which means that a logical 10th unit, if you get there, would be another Warlock, to get the 4 Warlock buff. Alternatively, you may consider cutting one of the warriors who is a loose end. The Tiny and the Troll Warlord are the 2 units that are only providing the warrior buff and have those loose end buffs like Primordial and Troll. When we level up, we can replace Tiny with 2 units as long as one of them is a warrior and keep our 6 warrior buff while picking up another buff. We probably don't want to cut the Troll Warlord since we have the Mask of Madness. Cutting Tiny for Tusk and Lone Druid would make sense to get this 4 Savage buff, or if you're facing mages, adding in a Slarter and a Medusa would also be good. For another example, let's look at a mage composition. This one is a bit of a mess. Notice the large amount of unfinished alliances. Primordial, Bloodbound, Heartless, Warlock, Dragon, and Elusive are all unfinished here. Even the alliances that are complete are not at optimal points. There are 5 mages, so it is 1 away from the 6 mage composition. Ideally, you commit to either the 6 mage buff, or stick with 3 and use better units in the extra spots, completing other secondary alliances. If you cut some of them down to 3 mages, some good options would be swapping Ogre Magi for Tiny or Morphling to complete the Primordial buff, while still keeping a reasonable frontliner. You could also swap Puck for a human, perhaps Kunkka or Lena, to get the 4 human buff. It also uses Knights, which are not the preferred frontline for mages. Abaddon is not really ideal in a mage composition because a big part of his power is the Heartless buff, which isn't even completed here. Regardless, the negative armor is not that useful when most of your damage is coming from magic damage. Omni Knight is okay since you have humans and mages, but this particular build has 3, so Omni Knight is purely excess. These examples show some typical formations that you may see for these compositions, but I'll discuss positioning more in depth with my next guide. So now that we have a pretty good idea about what makes a good composition, the last topic I want to touch on is how we choose which path to take on these tree of possible options. This is a very complex topic called the build path. It will definitely get its own video in the future, talking about different build paths at different points in the game, but I'll do a short summary here of the key points. Every single build in the game has its own branch of possibilities, making an incredibly complex tree of options and paths. Each unit that you purchase at every point in the game draws you down certain paths and away from others. And every unit that you do not buy or sell off moves you away from paths that use that unit. There are key units in each build that are individually very high impact, and also play a key role in the early game, which helps you transition to the mid-game builds. Some examples of these key units are Wind Ranger in Hunters, Kunkka or Doom in Warriors, or Razor in Mages. Getting one of these key units at all, but especially getting it to 2-star, will draw you heavily towards the path that utilizes them the best. I talked about the Hunter's build path in this video, but there are other more complex build paths with a core of warriors, or less complex paths like assassins. The key to becoming better at composition building is to understand more of these build paths, understand more of their key units, and the variations that are possible within them. The more of them that you know, the bigger playbook of options that you'll have. Once again, this is a very complex topic that really deserves its own video at some point. Hopefully this guide has given you a better understanding of how to think about and build compositions. Remember to not get too hung up on the specific examples I used here, but rather the broader concepts that they illuminated. Individual units and builds will change over time, but if you master the fundamentals, you'll be well equipped to understand a new meta, since after all, Dota Underlords is all about adaptation. If you found this video helpful, please do like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to keep up to date with all of my future Dota Underlords content. Thank you so much for watching. See you next time.